With Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets mentally devastated by the Battle of Wolf 359, these organizations would put their full resources behind projects that they would hope would ensure this type of tragedy would never happen again. And to this end, the Sovereign class would be born. But how exactly did this amazing class come to exist? Well, today we'll find out. Hello and welcome to another episode of Truth or Myth Beta Canon, a Star Trek web series that dives into the history of any given topic using beta canon sources and my own imagination to fill in the gaps. In today's episode, part 1 of a series of videos, we're taking a look at the road to the Sovereign class, as foreseen in Star Trek First Contact, to better understand its place in Star Trek history. As always, because this is a beta canon video, all information relayed should pretty much be taken with a grain of stardust, and only considered a little bit of Star Trek fun. And so, with all that out of the way, let's begin. It was a different time. Historians whose expertise lie in dissecting the era of the mid-24th century will often say. And with this dismissive statement, oftentimes those discussing this period in Federation history can look with fondness on the starship designs of the time. But the truth of the situation was far darker. The United Federation of Planets, having grown by leaps and bounds over the previous century, had allowed itself to become complacent, and perhaps even a bit arrogant when it came to the galactic stage. Federation records of the time show a large number of Federation presidents and their councils referring to the beginning of the 24th century through to the 2360s as a time of change, of peace, a golden age for both Starfleet and the UFP. It's not hard to understand why they viewed this era in such a manner. After all, their greatest and most fiercest enemy, the Klingon Empire, had sued for peace, with the 4 decades-long process of hammering out a treaty acceptable to both sides well underway. The Romulan Star Empire, for its part, had withdrawn back into their own space, amid rumors of civil unrest and fear over what a Federation and Klingon Empire as allies truly meant for them. Relations with the Tholians, Gorn, and Zenkethi had all been steadily improving, with ambassadors from each species taking up residence on Earth and participating in open council sessions. Even a new enemy encountered, known as the Cardassian Union, would be seen as mostly a joke throughout the Alpha and Beta quadrants, after a series of battles where their best warships were unable to defeat some of the weakest ships Starfleet had to offer. And so the citizens of the United Federation of Planets would settle into the new norm within the galaxy, one which they believe signified the supremacy of the Federation, leading to one of the largest mistakes ever made for the organization. The idea for the Sovereign class actually came about in the 2330s, when Starfleet's starship design teams presented an early starship design for Project Galaxy of a pure warship. She was to be large and sleek in nature, with the primary focus being on weapon systems and defense, with technological development projects to be initiated in those areas should the design be approved by the Federation Council. But of course it wasn't. Instead, the Federation's grand design was to see the Galaxy class come to fruition as it was in the early 2360s. A great city in space, a luxurious starship filled with Federation families. And development on what eventually would become the Sovereign class would be pushed aside and forgotten until 2365, when events would begin to conspire to prove to the Federation just how naive they had truly become. In the latter part of that year, the omnipotent being known as Q would fling the Galaxy-class starship USS Enterprise to System J25, where the starship under the command of Captain Jean-Luc Picard would make first contact with the Borg Collective. The Enterprise, the flagship of the Federation, with the best crew in Starfleet, was no match for a single vessel from the Collective. And when returned to Federation space again by Q, Starfleet immediately became worried about this new threat, and what they believed would be an inevitable confrontation with the Collective. And so Starfleet began to work on several plans to combat this threat. But when the Borg showed up a year later, on a course directly for Sector 001, Starfleet was simply not prepared. As often happens in political organizations, overestimates and various separate opinions would bog down the process of any true plan to deal with the Borg being developed. Given the distance to System J25, Starfleet believed that they had had far more time to bolster their defenses than what they actually had. And it also seemed that every admiral in Starfleet and planetary government within the Federation had a different view on how to proceed with the situation, with some member worlds even refusing to accept the idea that the Borg Collective could not be negotiated with, even going so far as to convince the Federation Council to allow them to send envoys in an attempt to make peace with the Collective and bring them into the Federation family. All these envoys were never heard from again. After about 6 months of in-house fighting and debate, Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth Shelby would emerge to convince both sides of the danger the Borg Collective truly represented, and Shelby would be appointed to head up Starfleet's Borg Defense Task Force in short order. Meeting with the Starship Design Team heads, they would brainstorm a number of projects designed with one purpose in mind: to engage and defeat the Borg. And then, in late 2366, a single Borg cube would be detected on a direct course for Earth, and 2367 would begin the humiliation of Starfleet at the Battle of Wolf 359, where this single Borg vessel was able to destroy 39 of 40 starships, resulting in a total loss of nearly 11,000 lives. Thankfully, the USS Enterprise D was able to use clever thinking at the last minute in order to save Earth, Starfleet, and the Federation, but the damage to the Federation's ego was done. From this moment on, Shelby was given a free hand to develop the technologies or starship classes she wished in order to prevent a tragedy like the Battle of Wolf 359 from ever happening again. To this end, starship types like the Defiant, Steamrunner, and Akira classes would be rushed into development, when a senior member of Starfleet's lead starship design team would present Shelby with another starship class, the Sovereign class. Being a junior member in charge of developing starship projects on Project Galaxy at the time, DeForest Harriman was only too happy to dust off the old design for Shelby to consider. And consider it she did, eventually realizing that a pure powerhouse battleship was exactly what Starfleet needed. And so, Project Sovereign would be launched. Shelby knew that the design for the Sovereign class was not only completely out of date, but that it needed to include all the newest technologies that Starfleet was developing. A big gamble for the now Commander Shelby, considering most were only in their earliest development stages. In fact, during this time, a lot of what only years before had been considered crackpot ideas and theories were now being developed with the full weight of the Federation behind them. But Shelby was a gambler, and decided the benefits from a starship class like the Sovereign class were simply too big to ignore, and so she would personally back the project herself. Within a month, the hull design would be approved by Shelby, and Starfleet's construction teams would begin to construct the prototype USS Sovereign. And although her basic lines would retain the shape that we would all come to know as the Sovereign class, many design problems, both internal and external, would cause several radical shifts for this starship class. And in the next part of this series, we'll take an in-depth look at the USS Sovereign herself, and continue with the history of this remarkable prototype for a vessel class that would end up symbolizing the latter part of the 24th century. I hope to see you then. Thank you for watching today's episode of Truth or Myth Beta Canon. What do you think of the history of the Sovereign class and the historical narrative that I've created so far? Do you want to see more videos like this one? Well, leave your comments in the section below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel design a starship class to engage and defeat the Borg? Then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper.